Hey folks, hope you all are doing well. I'm Karan Bandal from Econosite, your weekly economic wrap from India and around the world. So let's get started with trade. India's Forex position. Commerce and Industry Minister Piyush Goyal exuded confidence regarding the medium-term prospects of India's foreign exchange or Forex reserves position. India has around $600 billion in its Forex kitty. He stated that his positive assessment in this regard stems from multiple ongoing free trade agreement negotiations. Currently, India is negotiating trade pacts with the UK, Canada, the EU, and EFTA, which comprises Switzerland, Norway, Liechtenstein, and Iceland. Furthermore, the minister hailed India's exports figures of $776 billion for the financial year 2023, the highest ever. He assesses that India's import basket largely gets affected by oil, and its trajectory is likely to follow a downward trend in years to come, whereas India's export basket has value-added items that the world desires. This will likely lead to India generating a surplus in trade going forward, providing tailwinds to its already sizable forex reserves. Moving on to alternative macro metrics, Social Progress Index. How would you measure a nation's ability to provide for its citizens? One may naturally turn towards the economic indicator of gross domestic product or gross domestic product per capita, and that is true in a way. But one not-for-profit organization has come up with a unique index that sheds some light on how prosperity translates into well-being. It is called the SPI, that is Social Progress Index. It ranks 170 countries on how well they have provided for their citizens using metrics other than wealth. This is how the index is composed. It tracks 52 indicators that are then grouped into 3 categories. Each category carries an equal weight: basic human needs such as food and water, the foundations for long-term development, which includes education and healthcare, and the third one is opportunity, personal rights and freedoms. Now, you come to see some peculiar findings after comparing SPI scores from 1990 with those from 2020. Look at India and China, for example. China's GDP grew over 40 times in these 30 years, while India's GDP grew by over 8 times in the same period. Meaning, China grew 4 to 5 times that of India in these 30 years. SPI scores should indicate a similar imbalance. But SPI scores for both the nations grew by more or less the same amount. Also, it is tiny Bhutan sandwiched between India and China that advanced the most among the 170 countries. Its score jumped by 30 points as it greatly increased its provisions for meeting basic human needs. Incidentally, this is the same country that invented gross national happiness as a preferred metric to gross domestic product. All that to say, economic growth is important, but not the sole determinant for social progress. In rich democracies, though, the result still suggests a link between wealth and well-being. The richest countries are often the ones where citizens thrive. You can see almost all the top performing countries based on SPI scores are European and Scandinavian nations, with Canada the only North American nation featuring in the top 10. Let's end on a China-related story. How Australia stood up to China's economic bullying for 3 years. Back in 2020, as the world reeled under the devastation left by COVID-19, as it spread through nation after nation, all Australia did was that they dared call for an inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. That is when China started imposing trade blocks on Australia and launched a campaign of economic coercion against the country in 2020. The economies of the two countries, resource-rich Australia and commodities-hungry China, were complementary and closely connected. Australia's exposure to China then was quite high, at 8.2% of its GDP, double that of the United States. This reliance predominantly came from goods exports followed by services exports. China was clearly in a position to impose massive damage on Australian economy. China imposed a $16 billion hit on Australia by massively curbing shipments of everything from timber to coal, lobsters, barley and wine, which affected 5.5% of Australia's total annual exports. What went into Australia's favour was the fact that China's firms felt as much pain from the curbs as Australia's, if not more. Australian goods were hard to replace for China, both in terms of quantity and quality. And what China wasn't buying, Australia sold to others: barley to Southeast Asian countries, coal to India and Japan. Lobster fishermen and wine exporters, however, did struggle. But all in all, Australian exports only briefly suffered, then surged, and last year posted biggest ever trade surplus of close to 7% of its GDP. China has been slowly rolling back its import restrictions and seems to be gradually retreating. China's aggressive posture may have backfired as Australia stood firm, found alternative markets, joined strategic and military alliances such as Quad and AUKUS. Finally, Australia is trying to further reduce its dependence on China by signing free trade agreements with India and Britain. Another with the EU is in the works. In summary, India's positive economic outlook reflects similarly on its Forex reserves position, which already is quite comfortable. An alternative macro indicator to gross domestic product, that is social progress index, tells us that maybe democracies do a much better job at translating economic prosperity into well-being of its citizens. And Australia showed that it is possible to stand up to China's economic arm twisting. I hope you found this week's wrap interesting. I'll speak with you again next week. Until then, take care.